Welcome everyone to our first session on day 2 of the Virtual Rainbow Summit 2023. My name is Paul LaChapelle, and it is my pleasure to welcome our speaker for this presentation, Bradley Reinbold. Bradley Reinbold is a second-year graduate student at the University of Cincinnati. Currently he's in the process of earning his PhD in educational studies with a concentration of teacher education and curriculum studies. He has taught middle school in charter and public school districts for 5 years, and he currently teaches undergraduate students in higher education. His focuses are on social studies education, LGBTQ+ educator experiences, LGBTQ+ curriculum, and queer theory. Bradley, it is a pleasure to welcome you here today.
Thank you. So, like you said, my name is Bradley Reinbold. This is my research study, the experiences of a gay male as a former middle school educator in autoethnographic study. So let's get started. So the problem right now currently is this current increase in polarization has introduced many controversial bills, as many of you are aware, in many states, especially in K-12 education, that censor educators' autonomy, the experiences of LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bi, transgender, queer, or questioning, and more, and Black, Indigenous, people of color students as well. These bills hope to or have banned discussions on sex, sexuality, gender, race, and many more controversial topics. During my time teaching as a closeted gay male middle school educator from 2017 to 2021 in the United States, 132 anti-LGBTQ bills were introduced in K-12 or higher education to restrict LGBTQ+ educators and students. In all, 12 of the 132 bills introduced passed into law from the years of 2017 to 2021. In the historical context of these bills, legislators have shifted from focusing on excluding LGBTQ+ from student-led groups and restrictions on restrooms to a heavy stance on banning transgender youth from sports and restricting curriculum in our K-12 schools. As of late February 2023, these oppressive bills are gaining more and more traction. 148 bills have so far been introduced affecting K-12 education directly, mostly excluding transgender youth, banning curriculum and instruction of LGBTQ+ topics, and using biological pronouns. 126 of these 148 bills are advancing. Many of the proposed or passed bills have dire consequences, such as individuals can make complaints to actual state boards of education, which can result in the loss of an educator's licensure, termination, and loss of school funding. There are very few studies within my research field of social studies education concerning LGBTQ educator experiences. There's a lot in the research in social studies research that studies LGBTQ curriculum, gender, sexuality, homophobia, and current policies or gay straight alliances, but not much on educator experiences in K-12 schooling. And if there is, they're dated by several years. So the historical context in this is that educators have been excluded from the classroom. This is nothing, LGBTQ educators have been excluded from that classroom. So post-World War II increased this United States response to LGBTQ+ populations, which resulted in state-sanctioned homophobia. Joseph McCarthy's ideas were widespread on fighting communism, and he was able to promote a witch hunt hysteria that fully linked homosexuality and communism in the minds of most Americans. So this really affected educators and students because they were targeted during this time, and most being interviewed to come out without legal counsel. This was the larger picture of the police raids, the surveillance of gay bars and private homes that were happening. As a result of this 1950s legislation that tried to justify the firing of LGBTQ educators. In the late 60s and 70s, however, social movements gained momentum and many strides were made with proper evidence that had to be provided in order to fire any educator. The social stigma came with Anita Bryant, who was successful in further perpetuating this message that LGBTQ educators are pedophiles and cannot be trusted around children. And we've seen that come back today we're as the groomer message, right? In the late 60s and 70s, however, other autoethnographic studies have shown that navigating LGBTQ plus identities as an educator is difficult in the workplace. All of the previous autoethnographic studies that I looked at outside of my field cite support and relationships as vital to coming to accept their own identities and making teaching easier while being LGBTQ. I believe it's important to note that during the 90s, educators' experiences were plenty in the research and qualitative research field. And it has started to shift from that in education to the equally important LGBTQ youth and queer curriculum, which has resulted in less research on LGBTQ educators' experiences. So my positionality, before I explain this study, I identify as an out, proud, gay, cisgendered male in society. It has taken me a while to say this, especially in a professional setting within my research. I do also recognize, because I am white, male, middle class status in an oppressive society, I have power, especially as a researcher. I am also included in educational circles in which I work with undergraduate freshman students in higher education. I also have previous experience working in middle school students and charter and public school districts. Therefore, these experiences with my coming to accept my sexual identity and my passion for education have given me the lens to be able to see inequities in the educational system, understanding my identity and the power that I have, even as a gay researcher, heightens my awareness of the other marginalized communities. I realize my status in society compared to other marginalized communities other marginalized communities such as other LGBTQ plus people of color, women, Black, Indigenous people of color, students, and educators. This does not rid me of my privilege. However, it increases my want to create a safe research experience to others who may or may not be different from me. This can include those who are LGBTQ educators, students in a space where I may or could identify from them as a queer educator. However, I may not identify due to race, gender, or even teaching experiences. So the study's purpose is to essentially examine one identified LGBTQ plus middle school educator during the late 2010s and early 2020s through autoethnography. The study intends to identify how me, this gay male educator, navigated their middle school's educational challenges, supports, and social studies curriculum and practices. Not only does this study discuss how the gay male educator navigated through teaching middle school, but reveals how the past experiences affected his coming to accept his sexual identity in the larger context of a dominant heteronormative world. This research study's intent is to not be only self-healing for the researcher, but to empower and advocate for other LGBTQ plus educators who taught in the past or are currently teaching. Further, I hope this research lets LGBTQ educators know that they're not alone. They have a voice and should not be silenced or excluded. LGBTQ allies here, this is administration, colleagues, parents, students, must be aware of the unconscious or conscious ways that they hurt their LGBTQ educator colleagues and employees. And all this research also makes a call for action for these allies to help advocate for better treatment and less exclusionary practices that silence LGBTQ educators in our K through 12 public system today. With my research questions, I have my main research question, which was how do the past experiences of a middle school gay educator inform their acceptance of their sexual identity in a dominant heteronormative education system? After analyzing that central main question, I realized it was essential for me to kind of have sub questions. So, how did identified past challenges and supports in a middle school teaching environment affect the gay male educator? How did past social studies curriculum and teaching practices used in middle school affect the gay male educator? And then this one, how do former middle school students' experiences relate to the context of their former gay educator's identity acceptance? And that last one I'll get to in a little bit on more explanation. So I don't think it's surprising that I'm using queer theory as my theoretical framework. Queer theory critically analyzes the meaning of identity, focusing on intersections of identities and resisting oppressive social constructions of sexual orientation and gender. Foundational queer theory works were formed out of debunking of stable sexes, genders, and sexualities. Utilizing queer theory allows me to examine gender and sexuality as social constructs. Moreover, by recognizing the heteronormative world that we live in, can queer theory be effective in critically examining LGBTQ issues in society? Similarly, Mayo conveyed how the deconstruction of gender and sexuality through the lens of heteronormative social practices and norms is the goal of queer theory. By recognizing that heteronormativity further perpetuates a rigid view of gender and sexuality, queer theory can help address critical issues in education. Therefore, by critically analyzing LGBTQ issues through a queer theory lens, will help scholars to unpack the homophobia and other challenges that impact LGBTQ plus people's daily lives. So how I kind of applied this is the umbrella term queer seeks to somewhat push back at the binaries. Queer was used historically as a slur for LGBTQ plus people, which has since been reclaimed in the early 1990s, and more LGBTQ folks are identifying as such. The study is situated in queer theory because I believe we are still very much in a society where these rigid binary identities not only empower us, but also still oppress us at the same time. As Jones and Adams stated, queer theory developed in response to normalizing heterosexuality, as well as from a desire to disrupt insidious social conventions. Fluidity and dynamism characterize queer thought, motivating queer researchers to work against disciplinary legitimation and rigid categorization. In other words, I apply queer theory in this research study by queering my autoethnography by using a non-traditional methodology, which is autoethnography, and methods such as narratives and journal reflection entries as valid research methods to disrupt the dominant heterosexual narrative often constructed in society and even in qualitative research. So queer theory situated in autoethnography looks at the self through performative, transformative, fluid power structures to create more livable, equitable, and just ways of living. Therefore, this research study looks at me through the structures I had to navigate. It is transformative in the way in which I have realized I can be and exist in traditionally dominant heteronormative spaces. I can be fluid with myself in these once rigid binaries I felt oppressed by when I was teaching middle school. So my methodology. Autoethnography can be defined as the study of the self, where the researcher is the focus of the study. More specifically, autoethnography, as Polios stated, analyzes or interprets the lived experience of the author through the larger cultural context in society, such as self-identity, cultural rules and resources, communication practices, traditions, premise, symbols, rules, shared meanings, emotions, values, and larger social, cultural, and political issues. In autoethnography, researchers self-reflect and self-examine to achieve a sense of self-understanding of their personal experience. Even though researchers do in fact study a personal component of their lives, autoethnography ties it back to that cultural context and society. So how will I apply this, or how do I apply this? This study situates me in my own experiences while relying on the cultural and relevant context that surrounded me while I was teaching. This study applies autoethnography by doing just that. It analyzes my own personal narratives during the years I taught middle school and will provide former student interviews, which I hope to give a fuller picture of my own coming to acceptance of my own sexual identity in an oppressive heteronormative educational system. So my methods. I have already written 25 reflective journals of my past experiences in middle school teaching. This is my main data. I wrote these journal entries after I left middle school teaching at the end of the spring semester of my first year in my graduate program during the spring to summer of 2022. Each entry was organized in Microsoft Word documents and pulled from my own reflections as I tried to put myself back into my previous classrooms in which I taught. So essentially, when I came for my graduate or my doctorate degree, and when I first enrolled and I moved down here from Toledo, Ohio, actually, to Cincinnati, I couldn't stop. I don't know. I felt stuck and I felt kind of lost, and I couldn't stop reflecting on my teaching and reflecting on my experiences. And so my advisor kind of just told me, hey, just journal and get it all out and see where it goes. And this is where it kind of has gone. I hope to also conduct 4 semi-structured interviews, which which will last 1 hour via Zoom video and record audio recording technology. They will be these former students of mine will be speaking about their own experiences in the classroom in relation to my sexual identity. Their answers to the questions I will ask them will be their own thoughts and experiences in my former classrooms. However, the focus will remain on myself, who is the main research participant. I hope to gain more self-reflection from these and compare and maybe contrast what I said and my narratives to these student interviews in relation to my own identity, the challenges I face, the support I had, and the social studies curriculum and practices that were taking place. So my data analysis, as I concluded my writing of my journal reflections, it was time to analyze my data. I started by printing out all of the 25 journal reflections. I did multiple read-throughs before physically highlighting for initial codes. These initial codes were plenty during this as I wrote handwritten memos on each journal reflection with comments, emotions, and interpretations of what I had written. The initial coding process was an extensive list of 50 codes. Codes such as empathy, intolerance, struggle, regret, engaging, social justice, status quo, self-interested, staff, standardized testing, and ineffective teaching practices were a few examples of those 50 set codes. From this extensive list of codes, I developed 4 main themes: identity, challenges, supports, and middle school social studies education, and 10 sub-themes, which we'll get to on the next slide. So I believe these main themes and sub-themes not only help to describe my experiences in this autoethnography best, but also help me to answer my main research question. Since I used my personal journal reflections as the data, which are considered narratives, I implemented a narrative analysis. There are multiple ways in which one can apply a narrative analysis, but I focused on the thematic model of narrative analysis from Reisman 2008 as this thematic model focuses on the content of my journals rather than the structures of each story instead of like when we restory them in a narrative analysis. So it's more of the content and not necessarily the chronological order or such and such. So these are my main themes. Afterwards, I looked for key themes within my main research question. So I have identities, challenges, supports in middle school social studies, education. I use qualitative coding to find several different key phrases or ideas in each journal entry to find the sub themes. And so these sub themes are the ones that I found. I found for with identity, judgment and fear, hiding and regret, advocacy and empowerment. Challenges, I found toxic work environment, dominant reinforcement of heteronormativity. Supports, I had heterosexual ally mentorships, student support, and supportive work environment. And then middle school social studies education, I had teaching practices and exclusion of queer curriculum. So to kind of my findings, I never really, the following are some example narratives that I wrote that actually made it into or are making it into my research study. Identity, judgment, and fear was a huge component of why I did not come out in my teaching career. For example, I wrote, I never felt safe coming out or confiding with a large majority of colleagues due to the toxic work environments created and perpetuated. This fear of coming out and being myself within my professional work of K through 12 education impacted my teaching, my confidence, my mental and my physical health, and my overall joy or light of being an educator diminished. I was more fearful and did not feel safe coming out in the work environments I was in, and emotionally felt like I could not be myself. And then just a couple more findings, challenges and supports here. The dominant reinforcement of heteronormativity was also found in my teaching career. And this one states, my voice I could not control and usually was a higher voice compared to other heterosexual male educators with much deeper voices. I was skinny in weight, tall and lanky compared to the other heterosexual male educators who were often bigger in sizes with muscles. Because of these stereotypical gender norms being perpetuated, I felt inferior. I felt that I could not protect my students from school shootings or even fights because I was not man enough in size and could not be authoritative compared to them. And then for supports, I had immense student support, um, even though I did not come out. My students even supported me. I found because I was not like the other educators and actually treated them like humans, incorporating tolerance, empathy, and compassion. They respected me and often defended me against other educators. I realized I needed them more than they often needed me. And this one is, even my students defended me. I remember a specific moment in my classroom. I had received this new student. This new student asked me to my face if I was gay. Before I could respond, a few of my students said, don't say that to my teacher. That is rude. That is so rude. Why would you ask someone that? And then the student later apologized to me privately. Oops. So for social studies teaching and curriculum practices, this was a lot of data that I found here in my research study. There was just not many good social studies practices going on, teaching practices, and or there was no queer curriculum and there was no social justice curriculum. There was no, it was very white dominant, heteronormative. But this narrative says I felt 100% invisible How could I confidently teach any LGBTQ plus curriculum when I had no resources to teach it, no support to teach it, fear of teaching it? I also hid my own sexuality and was scared to incorporate any LGBTQ content, which I deeply regret not only for myself, but as for my students, to be that kind of that advocate and that role model for them. So as I kind of wrap this up, this is essentially the discussion here. Here, my story is it's not all that different from other LGBTQ identified educators, whether from the past or current. In the post 2010s context, LGBTQ educators are still having to navigate their sexual identity in unconforming and uncomforting or unsafe ways, though they may work in progressive school districts like I did. Wright and Smith confirm in their survey data, LGBTQ educators do not feel safe in the schools that they work. According to Jackson's phases of gay teacher identity development theory, relate to what many LGBTQ educators experience and how they navigate their identity. For example, I navigated the first and second phases of Jackson's theory as a gay male middle school educator. I decided to make the decision to stay in the closet, which is what the first phase suggests that an educator decides whether they stay in the closet or not, or comes out. Then I transitioned into the second phase of super teacher, where I decided to throw myself into my work by achieving that hyper busyness, that hyper teaching, and that hyperactivity, which resulted in myself editing the gay male that I was, or that I am. Many LGBTQ educators do this, as shown in previous autoethnographic studies. This type of hiding and teaching can result in burnout, which it ultimately did for me, um, and relates to the negative mental health aspects an LGBTQ educator may experience. Also, another key consideration here is the dominant standardized testing culture we have in the United States and in my school districts was normalized to the point of not even recognizing that there was very few authentic relationships and teaching practices going on that could have been put forth in way easier and much better ways. Also, the bigger impact was constantly aware and worried of my appearance, of what I could do to self edit my personality, and the overall being as a queer person. Um, and then back again to that standardized testing results in educators being more concerned with their students' academic performance than actually their mental health, a 2021 study showed. Students have reported in recent years high testing anxiety because of standardized tests. So it baffles me to why we're not, and even social studies in the state in which I taught didn't didn't have any state mandated tests in middle school in seventh or eighth grade, the grades that I taught. So it baffled me as why we were still teaching worksheets and out of the textbook instead of more Socratic seminars and engaging in-depth projects. Mentorship with like-minded individuals who value the same teaching styles and practices helped me help the gradual acceptance of my own sexual identity. These two mentors were meant everything to me. I did come out to both of them. They were the only two people I came out to over time during my teaching, and I felt very, very supported by them. And so, yeah, the lack of authentic social studies teaching practices and the lack of queer curriculum affected not only my teaching, but my ability to accept myself and come out in the classroom. In fact, my story of unauthentic social studies teaching practices in education in my middle school is not different from many others as well. And I believe the reason why is because this becomes to the status quo that comes into play here. If we were to teach the best practices that social studies education researchers and the National Council for Social Studies supports, it disrupts the status quo, that which privileges everyone and not the heterosexual white male cisgendered privilege that many educators unknowingly hang on to in social studies education. In other words, they like the way things that are already being done. Also, this authentic pedagogy might be minimalized due to the massive high accountability mindset for standardized testing with No Child Left Behind, implemented 23 years ago. And we're still seeing the effects, and we're still seeing that dominant standardized testing. So how do I relate this back to kind of queer theory? Is Foucault's idea of identity is communicated here. I assimilated to a more closed off and more heterosexual identity on the outside due to the historical and cultural influence in the work environments had on my identity. I was in a dominant heterosexual K through 12 education system, and I started to assimilate and act this way with my identity because I did not have a safe environment to be that identity that I know that I am. Foucault's idea of power comes into play as well. Because of the judgment, the fear, and the microaggressions I experienced, I felt that these educators in the work environments I was in had power over me. However, as I navigated through this, I found small instances of the possibility for resistance or reverse discourses. I would have loved to paint my nails, dye my hair, or even wear my or even wear my professional, flashy, and bright clothing that was not prescribed to my stereotypical cis male gender. However, I was afraid to. Butler conveys that producing these reverse discourses about gender and heterosexuality as truth in our society can help challenge the status quo and resist categorization. I could not do this because I was confined in the space that I had to navigate. So as I close up here, I would love for us to get to the day that our identities did not matter. However, as I come to accept myself post teaching in my middle school classrooms and teaching in higher ed, I realize these identities are important for us as LGBTQ plus educators. We have to stand strong and navigate them to survive until we find a day in which we do not have to come out. We can worry about what we were meant to do, which is teach. Thank you.